A missile has just struck critical water infrastructure near Tel Aviv. And if even a fraction of the damage being reported is accurate, then this is not just another headline. This is the kind of moment that can quietly rewrite the rules of modern conflict before the world even fully understands what has changed. Because when a conflict reaches the point where water itself becomes a target, the conversation is no longer only about borders, missiles, or retaliation. It becomes about survival, public pressure, regional panic, and the terrifying possibility that one strike can trigger consequences far beyond the place where it landed. What makes this so dangerous is not only the physical damage, but the message hidden inside it, because once you target the systems people rely on to drink, cook, wash, and live, you are no longer only trying to destroy infrastructure, you are trying to shake an entire society from the inside out. Before we move forward, I want to say something to you. I put a lot of effort into analyzing and gathering this news, but you don't even like the video, subscribe, or share it. I also take the time to reply to all your comments, yet I still don't get much response, which honestly makes me feel disappointed. I just have one request. Please support my main channel, Market Mindset, and also follow my backup channel, Market Mindset 2. And that is exactly why this moment deserves your full attention, because this is not a story about one blast. It is a story about escalation, pressure, fear, and the dangerous point where a regional conflict stops feeling regional and starts touching global nerves. To understand why this strike matters so much, you have to understand what water means in a city like Tel Aviv, where millions of people depend on a tightly connected network of supply, treatment, storage, and distribution systems that must function almost perfectly every single day. When that network is disrupted, even briefly, the effects can spread faster than the blast itself, because hospitals, schools, homes, emergency services, food systems, sanitation, and entire neighborhoods all begin to feel the shock at the same time. And that is where the fear becomes bigger than the damage, because the first question people ask is not what was hit, it is how long they can trust the taps, how quickly the authorities can respond, and whether the disruption is isolated or only the beginning of something much worse. That uncertainty is powerful, and in modern warfare, uncertainty is often the point, because the goal is not always to destroy everything immediately. The goal is sometimes to create enough panic that a nation starts feeling pressure from the inside before it even decides how to answer from the outside. So now the real question becomes this: was this simply a strike, or was this a signal? A deliberate move meant to show that the next phase of this conflict may not be fought only with missiles and drones, but with the systems that keep civilians alive. And once that question enters the room, everything changes, because now military analysts are not just looking at impact zones, they are looking at intentions, patterns, response options, escalation ladders, and the possibility that this attack was designed to force a larger strategic reaction. Iran's position in this broader confrontation cannot be ignored, because whatever one thinks about the strike itself, it did not happen in a vacuum. The tension between Iran and Israel has been building through a chain of retaliation, proxy activity, regional pressure, and constant military signaling. From Tehran's perspective, every move is framed through the lens of resistance, asymmetric response, and strategic leverage. While from Israel's perspective, every attack on civilian infrastructure is seen as a line crossed that cannot be left unanswered without consequences of its own. The clash of perspectives is exactly what makes this moment so dangerous, because when both sides believe they are acting defensively, the room for restraint gets smaller and the pressure to prove strength gets bigger with every passing hour. And in that environment, the most vulnerable targets become the ones that can create the most immediate psychological effect, because water is not abstract, water is not symbolic, water is daily life, and daily life is what people notice first when conflict begins to reach too close. If water distribution is interrupted, the consequences do not wait politely for diplomacy to catch up, because the clock starts immediately, and every hour of uncertainty increases the fear of shortages, contamination, repair delays, public health risk, and social instability. That is why attacks on critical infrastructure carry a weight that ordinary military exchanges do not, because a missile can destroy a structure in seconds, but the fear it creates can spread through a city for days, through a country for weeks, and through a region for much longer. And once fear takes root, governments are forced to respond not only to the strike itself, but to the public mood that follows it. Because citizens do not only ask whether their leaders will retaliate, they ask whether their leaders can still protect the basic systems of life. That is where the political pressure begins to rise, because leaders do not want to appear weak, adversaries do not want to appear deterred, and civilians are left trapped in the middle, trying to understand what comes next, while the strategic decisions are being made far above their heads. The situation becomes even more alarming when you zoom out and remember that water infrastructure is not just a local issue. It is tied to public health, economic continuity, emergency response, and the credibility of a state's ability to protect its own population under pressure. In other words, this is not just about whether a pipe, plant, or pipeline was damaged. It is about whether a city can continue functioning normally when the systems people take for granted suddenly become part of the battlefield. And that opens up a much bigger question that experts are already debating. Because if water infrastructure can be targeted in this way, then what stops future conflicts from pushing the same logic toward power grids, internet systems, food storage, transport networks, or other lifelines that modern societies depend on? That is the nightmare hidden inside modern warfare. Because the more connected a civilization becomes, the more vulnerable it is when someone decides to attack the invisible systems that keep everything running in the background. So the strike near Tel Aviv is not just a local event. It is a warning shot about how warfare is evolving, and how the targets of the future may not be tanks and trenches, but the arteries of ordinary life that most people never think about until they stop working. And that is why this story is drawing attention far beyond Israel and Iran, because the moment a conflict begins to threaten civilian essentials, the implications reach across borders, across markets, and across every capital, trying to understand what kind of world is emerging from this chaos. The United States is watching closely, because any escalation in this region immediately affects military planning, diplomatic pressure, regional alliances, and the already fragile balance that keeps a larger confrontation from breaking loose in a far more dangerous way. At the same time, energy markets do not wait for a press conference, and the moment traders think escalation risk has increased, oil prices, shipping expectations, and supply assumptions can all move at once, sending a signal that this is not only a military story but an economic one too. That is what makes the Strait of Hormuz so central to every serious discussion about this conflict, because when regional tension rises, the world immediately starts thinking about shipping routes, energy flows, insurance risks, and what happens if a crisis near one shoreline begins affecting everyone far away from it. This is how a single strike turns into a global story, because the direct damage may be local, but the indirect consequences can touch fuel prices, trade routes, investor confidence, and diplomatic priorities across multiple continents before the dust is even settled. And while policymakers discuss strategy in secured rooms, the humanitarian reality on the ground keeps getting heavier, because every family that wakes up uncertain about water is forced to live inside the consequences long before the analysts finish writing their summaries. That human side of the story is what often gets buried, and it should not be, because behind every infrastructure crisis are ordinary people who have to decide what to do next, how to keep children safe, how to trust the supply, and how to live with uncertainty that they did not choose. Hospitals cannot operate on slogans, schools cannot function on reassurance alone, and emergency systems cannot rely on vague promises when the material systems underneath them are under strain, which is why attacks like this create pressure far beyond the immediate blast radius. The deeper concern is that once one side sees infrastructure as a legitimate leverage point, other actors may begin to copy the logic, and that is how dangerous precedents are born, not through one dramatic declaration, but through repeated actions that slowly normalize what used to be unthinkable. History has shown again and again that when essential resources become weapons, the conflict tends to harden because a damaged building can be rebuilt. But a population pushed into fear over survival does not simply reset when the sirens stop. That is why this story feels bigger than the event itself, because it is about a pattern, a direction, and a world where the lines between military target and civilian necessity are becoming more blurred than many people ever wanted to imagine. And once those lines blur, the stakes rise instantly because the response options become more limited, the moral arguments become more intense, and the pressure on leaders to act with force grows even while the risk of escalation grows with it. That is the trap of this moment, because everyone can see the danger, but nobody can easily step back without appearing to concede strength, and in a high-stakes confrontation, that kind of perception can be just as powerful as the weapons themselves. Israel now faces a narrow and difficult set of choices, because a direct military response could satisfy the demand for deterrence, while also increasing the odds of a wider regional conflict that nobody fully controls once it begins moving. A covert response could be more measured, but even then the cycle of retaliation can continue, because in conflicts like this, every move is read not only for what it does, but for what it signals to allies, enemies, and domestic audiences. Diplomatic pressure is another path, but diplomacy moves slowly, and crises involving critical infrastructure move quickly, which means that by the time international statements are carefully drafted, the emotional and strategic momentum may already be shifting toward harder options. That is why this event is so difficult to contain, because it sits at the intersection of military force, civilian vulnerability, legal debate, public fear, regional rivalry, and global market sensitivity, all at the same time. And when one event sits at the center of so many overlapping pressures, it becomes more than a headline. It becomes a test case for how the world responds when modern conflict begins targeting the things that keep ordinary life alive. So the question is no longer just whether this strike caused damage. The real question is whether it changes the mindset of the region. Because once a line is crossed and not answered decisively, the next strike can feel easier for someone else to justify. That is the kind of escalation spiral that experts worry about, because every retaliation narrows the space for compromise. Every warning becomes harder to trust, and every side starts preparing for the possibility that the next move may be even more severe. And once that fear takes hold, civilians pay the price first, because they are the ones who live with shortages, sirens, uncertainty, disrupted routines, and the emotional burden of trying to continue normal life while the world around them feels less stable by the hour. This is also why the story is not just about one country, because the broader region is already under stress from conflict, climate pressure, infrastructure fragility, and political instability, which means a single shot can land on top of conditions that were already dangerously strained. When you combine climate stress with military pressure and infrastructure targeting, you create a formula that can destabilize societies in ways that are harder to reverse than damage from conventional battlefield exchanges. That is the deeper nightmare here, because the future of conflict may not look like massive armies moving across borders. It may look like silent attacks on systems so essential that a city feels the impact before it even understands what happened. And if that is the direction warfare is heading, then every major power has to rethink what protection actually means. Because defense is no longer only about missiles and jets. It is about resilience, redundancy, emergency planning, and safeguarding the lifelines hidden inside everyday life. So when people ask why this strike matters so much, the answer is simple. It matters because it is not only about destruction, it is about precedent. And precedent is how conflicts evolve from isolated acts into new standards of what is considered acceptable. The world should be paying attention not because the shock value is high, but because moments like this often reveal where the next danger is coming from. And the next danger is almost never limited to the first place that made headlines. This is why analysts, diplomats, and ordinary viewers alike should keep watching closely, because the next response, the next statement, the next military move, or the next piece of evidence could shift the story from serious to much more dangerous very quickly. And through all of that, the most important fact remains the same, that behind every strategic discussion is a real population trying to live, adapt, and stay safe while leaders, militaries, and markets process the consequences of a crisis they did not create. That is what makes this so hard to ignore, because once people understand that water, survival, and public confidence are now part of the battlefield, the entire conversation about war, restraint, and international responsibility changes in a fundamental way. And whether this moment becomes a turning point or just another step in a longer escalation will depend on what happens next, how each side interprets the other, and whether the world responds with enough seriousness before the situation moves beyond control. The terrifying truth is that nobody benefits from a conflict that keeps climbing through civilian vulnerability, because the more infrastructure is drawn into the fight, the less room there is left for stability, trust, or quick de-escalation. That is why this is bigger than anger, bigger than retaliation, and bigger than a single act of destruction. Because it is really about whether the world is heading into an era where basic human necessities become bargaining chips in geopolitical confrontation. And if that future sounds alarming, it should, because once a civilization normalizes the targeting of life-supporting systems, the line between military strategy and humanitarian disaster becomes dangerously thin. So stay alert, stay informed, and keep questioning what this means, not only for Israel and Iran, but for every country that depends on fragile systems it assumes will always keep working until the day they do not. If you found this breakdown valuable, like this video, share it with someone who needs to understand the seriousness of this moment, comment your opinion below, and subscribe to Market Mindset for more deep, high-impact analysis like this.